case I'm making is that if you treat the free energy principle dynamics in this relational way of mind being this relationship between organism and environment, and then you have the relational quantum mechanics piece in play, and you understand that matter itself is relationship, and if mind is also relationship, consciousness is also relationship, then I think when you combine these, there no longer needs to be a conceptual gap in our understanding of reality. I think this is a way to resolve the hard problem of consciousness and have a coherent picture of the natural world that doesn't have any fundamental disjunctions.
Yeah, no, I concur with that.
I find Terence Deacon's term teleodynamics useful here when it comes to thinking about life. So he speaks about
that's probably one of the words that I learned about.
Maybe it came up in the book. Yeah, teleodynamics, where a system has a goal-directed self-organization. It's organized around this goal of self-persistence in a way that I can melt down the thermostat and it's not going to try and stop me. So it seems to me a genuine level of emergence with cellular life. There's nonlinearity where it's the same nonlinearity between life and death. It's almost like teleodynamics keeps you together actively through your life, and then the moment you die, you shift into reverse gear, and now suddenly the second law is going to win.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the poetry in your book is now coming back to me. Now,
okay. I'm channeling it now, yeah. Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. I'm getting over a cold at the moment, so apologies if my voice isn't currently up to scratch, but it should be fine in the conversation itself. This week on the podcast, I'm speaking with previous guest, Professor Karl Friston. Karl is a theoretical neurobiologist and Professor of Neuroscience at University College London. He's also an honorary consultant at UCL's Queen Square Institute of Neurology and is a fellow of both the Academy of Medical Sciences and the Royal Society. He also happens to be the most cited neuroscientist in the world. As an undergraduate at Cambridge University, he studied natural sciences with a specialism in physics and psychology and went on to train as a psychiatrist. He first rose to prominence after inventing multiple techniques for analyzing brain imaging data, and later turned his attention to developing a unified theory of the brain, the free energy principle. His work forms a key part of the argument I make in my new book, The Dawn of Mind, which is out today in the UK and worldwide. Karl kindly read an advanced copy of the book and gave me a blurb for it, which we referenced in the conversation, so I'll read it out here. A remarkably current and forward-looking treatment. This book uses all my favourite words in the right order, and some I've never encountered before. It offers a delightful narrative grounded in state-of-the-art thinking about what it is to be an observer, or, in the author's words, being is believing. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Professor Karl Friston. You very kindly gave a blurb for The Dawn of Mind, and in it you said it uses all your favourite words and some new ones you'd never heard before. I should have asked you this 6 months ago, because you've probably forgotten what those words were now. But I wanted to ask at the time what they were, but it slipped my mind too. Do you recall?
I don't, but I would have taken notes. But I'll have to go back to my email to see what they were.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought they'd be on the tip of your tongue. So when it comes to the topic of consciousness, I feel like you've teamed up with lots of different collaborators, and different collaborators kind of making different points. I'm curious as to if you are, from reading that stuff, it gives the impression of a lack of a fixed, decided stance and more of like an openness to this exploration. Is that where you're at? Is that an accurate description?
No, I think that's a very nice description. Yeah. You phrase this as teaming up with lots of people. I think I personally do celebrate the diversity of ways that people approach this issue, and try to identify the common themes and accommodate. I think most theories of consciousness have something very useful to say, that they all emphasize or foreground one aspect or another aspect. And I'm usually left in a state of enriched knowledge, through these different perspectives, but also challenged in terms of trying to understand, how one would write that down, say mathematically, from a physics-based perspective.
Right. Yeah, and I think I definitely share that perspective that all of these different approaches are maps, they're stories to approach this phenomenon, and so they typically all contain some truth, and the phenomenon itself can't be very neatly encompassed by one simple story. I think this is true for lots of natural phenomena. And actually there's this idea that's very central to my thinking about this stuff, which is I think best articulated in the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness, the idea that things exist in a kind of interdependent process way rather than in terms of there being a kind of fixed essence. So if you take money as an example, I think most people can understand that a note itself may have very little intrinsic worth, but its monetary value comes from the way it's used in a kind of conventional relationship, how it can be used in that network of the economy. And in a similar way, rainbows, as a child, you may think there's actually something there physically, but then you learn that actually there's the interdependent framework of the humidity and the perspective and the light coming through, and that all comes together as a process to create this thing that seems to be a solid, substantial thing called a rainbow. And I think that when science kind of really gets behind certain phenomena, typically science can begin with these kind of naive substance-based explanations about some vital force in life. And then when you actually explain it, you see it's a relational, interdependent process. And I think what's really great about the free energy principle is I think it really captures that. It looks like how a theory should look, I think, if it's really describing something true about this phenomenon, because everything's kind of interdependent. Even if you start with the imperative to minimize surprise, then it's like, okay, well, there needs to be some context or some model about the world, and that needs to be involving some kind of sensory information coming in, and that model needs to be being leveraged by action. So actually, no matter where your entry point is, you end up in this loop without any kind of, well, here's the solid foundation, but the whole interdependent process is the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you bring a lot of key themes to the conversation there. Just going back through that, the notion of consciousness as a process, I think, is quite fundamental. And I don't mean that in a philosophically nuanced way. I mean that as somebody trying to understand sentience, or at least sentient behavior, what looks like sentient behavior through the lens of physics. You are dealing with dynamical processes. So, one analogy I often bring to my own machinations is, can you ask the question of a certain definition of consciousness that you would ask of evolution? Is there a state of evolution? Or is it better to think of evolution as a process of self-organization? So I think that's quite crucial. Again, not from a philosophical stance, but just if you wanted to articulate that kind of notion mathematically, you'd be starting with a process that unfolds in time. The other aspect you brought in was the relational aspect. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I'm certainly mindful of that on a number of counts. One thing that comes immediately to mind is the work of Carlo Rovelli in understanding the implications of quantum physics and quantum information theory. And he certainly emphasizes that relational aspect. So many of the paradoxes that you see in quantum physics are effectively dissolved if you appreciate there's Bob and Alice, and then there's you talking about Bob and Alice. And I think that perspective is very beautiful. And it, also foregrounds something I think you were hinting at in terms of the way that we make sense of the world in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves. And that these stories very much rest upon the relationship of ourselves to the world, which has, you mentioned the word loop. There's a loopiness there, and you can read that in, a Hofstadter sense, or you can read it in terms of the circular causality, in terms of my reciprocal engagement with that world. And of course, if that world is constituted by other things that are doing the same kind of sense making, and that may include a sense of selfhood, then you've got a cultural context in which to make sense of, or to describe to your children the nature of a rainbow. That's a rainbow. Of course, it's only because you believe it's a rainbow. That's your story, your fantasy that you've inherited from your parents. So I think, there are so many, the setup to that question, I think, contains a lot of quite fundamental issues.
Right, yeah, and I think that the key pieces that need to be in play, I mean, what I'm reaching for is the feeling that with the free energy principle, and I'm glad to hear you mention relational quantum mechanics that Carlo Rovelli has spoken about, because to me that's crucial. And the case I'm making is that if you treat the kind of free energy principle dynamics in this relational way of mind being this relationship between organism and environment, and then you have the relational quantum mechanics piece in play, and you understand that matter itself is relationship, and if mind is also relationship, consciousness is also relationship, then I think when you combine these, there no longer needs to be a conceptual gap in our understanding of reality. I think this is a way to dissolve or resolve the hard problem of consciousness and have a coherent picture of the natural world that doesn't have any fundamental disjunctions.
Yeah, no, I concur with that. And one could even argue, as people like Andy Clark have argued, that the hard problem of consciousness is in and of itself a rainbow. It is just a story we tell ourselves to understand some of the deep recursive challenges in terms of self-modeling and other modeling that just would not be there if I lived in a universe that did not constitute other things that I could confuse with myself. As soon as I have something else that may plausibly be explained, or whose behavior, observable aspects of the behavior may be plausibly explained by that thing is something like me, then I have the hypothesis, well, perhaps that thing is conscious, because I believe that I am conscious, because that's a story I tell myself to explain all my machinations, both on the inside and the outside. So again, even the hard problem of consciousness, I think, has this quintessentially relational aspect that is only emergent in the context of multiple similar kinds of self-organizing creatures or systems co-constructing their lived world. And on that view, communication becomes, I think, quite, well, let's put that another way. It would surprise me if philosophy could be done without communication.
Yeah, I think this relational or interdependent aspect really runs through everything. So as you pointed with the hard problem, like with any explanation of anything really, we're not looking to account for any intrinsic essence with something in isolation. If you want to understand the physics of water, you're not going to take away everything else you know about the universe and just try and explain water. To explain something is to have a relational map of, we'll follow this here and it connects there. I think that's important because some people can make the mistake, I think, of thinking that the gap is between, when it comes to the hard problem of consciousness, that the gap is between our descriptions of the world and then the phenomenon of consciousness itself, and that the equations are supposed to kind of jump off the page and swallow up the phenomenon, which isn't how I think about this stuff. I think we have a story, a relational map of our understanding of matter. We have a story, a relational map of our understanding of mind, and then with this combination of relational physics and free energy dynamics, you now have a way to make those stories play very nicely and hang together in a way where you can follow the map into new areas. And you mentioned that in your work you're kind of describing this in terms of physics, and I think physics is also a kind of excellent example of this way of explaining things, because none of the terms mean anything without all the other terms. If you just take one thing in physics and you make the mistake of thinking, well, that actually contains that essence. That's not what the map of our understanding is. It's always this relational map.
Yes, no, that is so true. I mean, the kind of physics that underwrites the free energy principle is exactly the same kind of physics that you'll find in quantum mechanics and in statistical mechanics and in classical mechanics in the limit. And it all rests essentially on probability density processes as they evolve in time. And as soon as you have a distinction between me and my world, then you introduce the notion of conditional dependency. So that, I think, would be the mathematical space that you talk about relationships. How does my probabilistic either description of my biophysics or indeed my conditional beliefs, my subpersonal Bayesian beliefs that supervene on that biophysics, how does that depend on something else? This is the the anatomy, the calculus that the free energy principle brings to the table. But I should also say it is exactly the same calculus that quantum physics uses. I mean, if you just think about probability amplitudes, this is a physics of beliefs. It's a physics where if I read a belief in a mechanical sense as a conditional probability distribution, then quantum physics just is a physics of the process of belief updating. So, that relational aspect, I think, even emerges as fundamental right at the beginning of things like the free energy principle, and also I would contend much of quantum mechanics, in the sense, if you just think about all the interesting issues and all the arguments that inherit from an interpretation of quantum mechanics writ as maths, then it's all about observation, it's all about measurement. And as soon as you look at measurement as a process, observation as a process that is basically a belief updating process, then you can describe all of this in terms of inference and understanding and telling stories that best explain my sensorium.
Right, right. Yeah, so it'd be great to kind of circle around that a few times just to make sure people are getting that, because there's so much rich detail in what you said, and it's really the core of the free energy principles. So if I approach it again in a different language, if you have something that is a thing that seems to be hanging together over time and is different from its environment, then you can distinguish one from the other. And the only way that can be the case is if there's a certain structure to how they influence each other. So the thing acts in some way on the environment acts in some way on the thing, and there's this kind of a certain way in which that kind of has to certain dependencies have to be the case for that thing to exist over time. And then you can extrapolate that into a kind of sensation action loop like we see in living things. We have senses and we can act on the world, and that's how we keep ourselves together over time. But crucially, in between the sensation and action, this kind of resonance occurs with the outside world where we have what you're calling beliefs, these kind of probability distributions about inferring what's going on out there, so we can leverage those beliefs to take actions that are in line with our survival. And crucially, I think, well, in humans, that inference process, that predictive processing process, seems to account quite nicely for the contents of consciousness. And yet that also not only kind of goes down through all life in terms of self-organization, but as you're pointing to, goes down to particles, subatomic particles, anything that can be identified as a thing. There's this kind of structure. So we can delve into the richness of this continuum, but I think it's the fact that there's a continuum there, even if people may debate, well, where do we want to call it mind? Where do we want to call it consciousness? Which would be fun to talk about, because I think you could make an argument for lots of different places on that continuum, and I have my preference. But fundamentally, you have a physics that takes you from matter to mind with the same equations, the same story, you could say, with different things emerging at different stages. But it's fundamentally a kind of coherent story of physics that includes life and mind, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and that was a nice picture or explanation for people not familiar with the Bayesian mechanics that complements quantum mechanics and system mechanics. Just to demystify that sort of definition of thingness. I'm guessing you wanted to say Markov blanket, but didn't want to frighten your listeners.
Yeah, I meant to introduce that term, but I forgot.
So yeah, the Markov blanket, which was not introduced, is basically the thing that separates me from the rest of my universe. And I think it's just useful to sort of demystify this Markov blanket. It's just a specification of the inputs and outputs to me. And I think probably usefully conceived of as like a bottleneck, a two-way road. Immediately that as soon as you say that, you induce this certain causality or the loopy interaction between me and the rest of my universe, and that bottleneck puts certain constraints on what must be the case if I endure over a non-trivial amount of time. And one key constraint is that there has to be a generalized synchrony between the outside and the inside, and yet that synchrony is mediated through this very, very sparse, very, very constrained bottleneck. in the sense that it has very few degrees of freedom, and yet somehow I can reconstruct what's going on the outside in order to predict and to engage with, dance with, synchronize with the outside, just given a very, very selective sampling of that lived world. And of course, this is entirely symmetrical. The outside is doing exactly the same thing. It's synchronized with whatever is going on in the inside, even though it can never ever see what's going on the inside. It can only see what is exposed on the Markov blanket or in terms of the outputs of me to the world. I'm talking about the universe in a sort of generic sense, but of course, me as an observer of you, I become the universe. I become not you. So I can never know, just based upon my exchange with you, whether your internal machinations have the attribute of a conscious process or not. But I can certainly infer that's highly likely, given that's the most plausible explanation in my consciousness for the way that you are behaving and the way that we are at this moment engaged in a generalized synchrony. There is turn taking, there resonance, there is a reciprocity, there's a mutual inference going on, simply because we are similar, and that then licenses me to make the inference that you must have the same kind of consciousness, or at least the same kind of experiences that I believe that I have, which may of course be a fantasy, but it's a good enough explanation for license.
Yeah, yeah. And so in writing The Dawn of Mind, I tried to come up with simplified explanations of the free energy principle, because obviously it can be quite technical and hard for non-specialists to get their head around. And in particular, there's this way in which, I think you alluded to it earlier, that evolution and inference are the same thing, which is particularly beautiful, I think, where, so as you were talking about this kind of synchronization, this dancing with the environment, someone can think of animals evolving over time, and then, for example, a giraffe's neck comes to match the height of the trees where it lives. The giraffe never gets out a tape measure and measures the tree and then grows its neck to match it. There's never a direct interaction of that kind. But instead, this resonance happens where there's the kind of the model being brought to bear, which is the population of giraffes, and then the ones that are fit to the environment are retained. And through that way, this kind of sculpting happens. And then moment to moment, that's happening, I think, in the phenomenon that we call the mind, is that life is a kind of open-ended evolutionary process of trying to discover how to be in the world, not a bag of fixed static mechanisms, but a moment-to-moment evolutionary process. Maybe is the way that I would describe it. Actually, does that description resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, technically, natural selection is just a free energy minimizing process that if you were a statistician, you call Bayesian model selection. It just operates over a very slow timescale. So if you stood back and were able to observe evolution in play, it is just basically testing different hypotheses, inferring what kind of phenotype is fit for purpose in me as the environment. And of course, having these kinds of phenotype that act back on the environment means that you've now got all sorts of interesting self-organization, again, a circular causality in place, so that now you can appeal to things like Evo-Devo or cultural niche construction, so that you are now imbuing the environment with the potential for selective pressure, in the sense that what if I am fit for my environment, then my environment is fit for me, or more specifically, I think more acutely, if we are fit for our environment, our co-constructed environment, then our co-constructed environment is apt for our endurance and survival within that. Again, appealing to this sort of symmetry that's implicit in having this synchrony and endurance and persistence. And in one sense, it could not be any other way. So, one of a Dan Dennett's strange inversion here on the free energy principle. It's not saying you have to minimize your free energy or your surprise in order to survive. It's the other way around. It's if you survive, then you can be described as minimizing your free energy.
And that survival piece maybe can help people connect the kind of self-organization of life to evolution over generations, because that self-organization is a maintaining one's order, is surviving moment to moment, which is why these dynamics are necessary. I came up with an analogy earlier today that might be a bit clunky, but I'll give it a go. So I was thinking about how when you're dealing with the fringe principle, I think it was in Mark Soames' book, the way that he worded it, Hidden Spring, he spoke about systems trying to minimize information, or minimize information flow, perhaps. And so people can use different language about this stuff, but that led me down a kind of a way of thinking, which is you could say, and tell me if you think this is an accurate way to kind of simplify this, but if you think about two different kinds of information, you could have information in terms of events being newsworthy, which you might technically call surprise or information content. And anything that keeps itself together over time has to keep that low. It has to not be surprised. No news is good news from the perspective of life, because if you're constantly being surprised, I guess you could say there's like an asymmetry. You're unlikely to be constantly given nice things. You're going to get a lot of negative things in a universe that's statistically, moving towards greater entropy because those states are more probable. So you're going to have this bias. If you're surprised a lot, it's going to end up, being entropy, which is technically true, right? That the long-term average surprise is entropy. So you want to keep your news low. You want to keep that sense of information low. But the only way to do that is to remain informed. So there's this mutual information between your internal states, your beliefs. And so you're kind of keeping one kind of information high in order to keep the other information low. And then to connect this with survival and evolution, the kind of clunky analogy I was coming up with was if there are people, watching a football match, and at the start a supervillain comes on television and says, when the first goal is scored, I'm going to announce like a safe evacuation zone, and everyone who misses that announcement is going to be killed. And so what would happen there is football fans who are watching they'd be staying informed. They're watching the unfolding events. They see when the goal is scored, they get the message, they go to the safe space, they survive. People who are not football fans, who are not watching, for some reason no one tells them about this, but they're not staying informed, so they get this surprise, this new piece of information that they're going to be killed. And so what you end up with there is, if that was happening again and again and again, you'd have this strong selection pressure for football fans being and if that's passed on genetically, or even just moment to moment, you now have survival and evolution playing out through this dynamic. So that was a way that I was thinking about how it might help people to think of how this single process is both to do with the mind in terms of how we relate to the world moment to moment, but also evolution. It's that relationality piece again. If you say, well, is this inference or is this evolution or is it Bayesian model updating? All of those words they're just words, they're stories, different language games we can use to describe this single phenomenon. And I think what this comes down to is a kind of scale-free physics of forms. Any form that exists over time has to be playing this game. So it feels quite kind of anti-reductionist to me, instead of a physics where the particles are most real and everything else is epiphenomenal. This feels like that's a kind of horizontal axis, whereas this is like a vertical axis of across all scales, anything that hangs together over time. I mean, I'm not heard you speak to this, but I would say it's going to be equally real in that sense. I don't have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you bring two really key points to the table here. The first is this curious dialectic between trying to avoid surprises on the one hand, and yet engaging in behaviors where we're sensation seeking. So I'd like to come back to that, but just before that, the other key issue, which is this sort of notion of a vertical perspective where the same rules, the same game is being played in a scale-free way at ever increasing scales and all the way up and all the way down. I think that's an absolutely spot on and crucial insight, which again reinforces this relational aspect. It is only relevant, really, how I behave as a phenotype moment to moment in terms of surviving, in the context of the culture or the eco-niche in which I operate, in the same sense. And that would be what people like George Ellis would consider sort of bottom-up causation. But there's also a top-down causation, bringing us back to this circular causality, that the eco-niche puts certain constraints and inductive biases on my propensity to survive, and of course provides the context for my process of inference and behavior and the like. So I think that scale-free aspect is incredibly important. And if you had the opportunity, you should get Chris Fields on. Kind of like level.
Great, yeah.
because he would certainly emphasize that scale-free aspect. And I think it's the scale-free aspect that allows you, exactly as you say, to equate in terms of the nature and the functional form of the process, evolution, understanding. You could even take it right down to cellular organization, inferring a cell inferring where it should be during neurodevelopment or its development more generally. So I think that's quite a key thing. And I suspect we might come back to that scale-free argument, and particularly Chris Field's notion of the inner screen model of consciousness later on. Can I come back to your football match? Because I think that's an excellent.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also this the point you're making, which I think is it's like a beautiful paradox. On the one hand, we are in the game of avoiding violations of our expectations that we are adaptively fit things that fit comfortably in our environment and in our body. That is simply a description of, say, homeostasis at the level of physiology and at that time scale, or a statement of adaptive fitness at an evolutionary time scale, somatic versus evolutionary, respectively. So is that the full story? Well, to the extent that surprise minimization is in the moment, I think that is perfectly viable. But now let's just think about the football example. I am actively choosing to remain seated and actively looking at the game. Why am I doing that? Well, because I know that in this context, I'm likely to get some information about the outcome. I will know. I don't know who's going to win at the beginning of the game, but I do know with absolute certainty that I will know if I continue to stay in the match. So, but staying in the match is something that an agent does. It's not about sense making. It's not about building stories or hypotheses that best explain all the data that is given to you. It's about action. It's having agency and being able to act on the world. So, one way I look at this sort of the paradox that you brought, that you were very nicely disclosing, is that perception is in the game of resolving or avoiding surprises, whereas action is in the game of maximizing information gain and seeking out the certain kind of surprises that are indeed newsworthy. So I'm thinking here of sort of Andy Clark's description of prediction errors. The only newsworthy part of some sensory input is the part that I didn't predict. And that's the thing that's going to change my mind. That's the thing that's going to drive my internal dynamics, my belief updating. And as such, it is that I need to resolve. But when acting in a way that determines the kind of sensations you get that elicit those kinds of prediction errors, there's I think a more nuanced notion of surprise. Technically, it's called Bayesian surprise. Technically, it's expected information gain, and that means that I'm going to seek out situations where I know I will resolve my uncertainty. I will be informed. So the people, well, I won't go as far as going to the safe zone, but the people who stay in the auditorium until the end of the game are basically leveraging the fact that they know that if they act in this particular way by maintaining a commitment to sitting in their seat, they will come out with resolved uncertainty about who won. And for them, that's very, very important. And we all celebrate, we all celebrate, certainly when it comes to the World Cup. We all get very excited about who's going to win. It's a delicious kind of uncertainty, expected surprise, which we know can be resolved if we all watch the match, usually together, to watch each other sort of enjoy that sort of collapse of uncertainty as it comes along. But surprise can, the vernacular or the sort of surprise of the kind that I get when I open a present, I think is probably best understood in terms of that resolution of uncertainty. That's what they bought me. That's what I'm going to be playing with for the next few hours or months if it's a really good present. But of course, that kind of surprise is evinced through acting. It's acting, it's unwrapping the present. It's not the kind of surprise that you get if you're just sitting there and something very unexpected happened, like there was a blackout or you lost your connection. That does not depend upon you as an agent acting upon the world. It is something that you did not anticipate, given what you understand about the nature of the world.
Right. Yeah, and it's nice there's that hedonic kind of positive valence of knowing you're going to get your uncertainty resolved and it getting it resolved, because I guess that's a powerful strategy for survival that would have been reinforced over time, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, appealing to this sort of strange inversion of the energy principle. If you do survive in time, you must show this
Right.
kind of behavior over a certain time scale. And I suspect you're going to take us down the road back to the continuum. At what point, does one
Right.
is one entitled to say that a thermostat or a virus is a thermostat or a virus conscious, or do I have to go further into the continuum, deeper into the continuum, or not? But in principle, um, everything that, from the point of view of physics, everything that possesses these characteristic states by acting upon the world in order to remain in these characteristic states can be described um, in terms of trying to get as much information from the world as possible to minimize the expected uncertainty or uh, the the to maximize the information gain, to minimize the expected surprise or uncertainty about the sensory inputs.
Right. And you mentioned kind of agency and you've written about this phenomenon of when you put two pendulums on a shelf, they come to synchronize, and you can model that the same way as if one is acting on the other with the vibrations moving through the shelf. But most people would look at that and say, well, that's kind of as if it's acting, right? Like it doesn't have the kind of action that we have, where we're the kind of the proximate cause of our we don't it doesn't set a goal and intend to do it as far as we can see. So with that true kind of agency, do you see that come into existence with life?
Um, yes, I think that's a great question. The, um, I think your use of the word intend is absolutely crucial here.
Right.
I think that so the reason I'm pausing is would I define life as biotic self-organization that has intentions under the hood? I'm not sure I would actually. I think you can get kinds of biotic self-organization where intentions are not necessarily part of the games, and there are certain organic um, um, cycles, and dynamics and systems that have biorhythms that don't have intentions. I would say that they were living, but I think that the kind of life form that you're talking about would I think would be characterized by having intentions, and that begs the question: what is an intention? Does a thermostat have an intention to keep the room at a particular temperature? Do you have intentions of that sort, or of some fundamentally qualitatively different kind of goal in mind? Yes, you use the word goal as well. I, you know, and for me, as soon as you use those words, I start to think immediately, well, what's the difference if I had to write these processes down in terms of differential equations, for example? What's the difference between a goal that is reached through intentional behavior and the set point of a thermostat, or the set
Mm.
point of a particular generalized homeostasis in, say, a virus, or something that had a physiology but just had homeostasis, or indeed the attracting set of two clocks that showed this generalized synchrony. So I think the two words goals and intentions tell you that there may well be two different kinds of life form, and my suspicion is that the having the ability to form intentions that are goal pointing um, characterizes certain natural kinds that are more likely to be sentient or to have a certain kind of consciousness, specifically agency. So in my world, to be an agent is to have a generative model entailed by your internal machinations that includes the consequences of your action. So on that view, a thermostat or a virus would not be an agent in this full sense or in this strong sense. To be an agent is to actually have a model of the consequences of your action. And if those consequences are within your model equipped with some kind of priors, then you've now got a definition of goals. Because if I believe that the consequences of my action will produce these characteristic outcomes, and these characteristic outcomes now become my goals. And that provides a mechanics or a metric that allows me to choose between this course of action and that course of action, because I can roll out into the future, evaluate the consequences of acting like this or acting like that, and see which is most consistent with my goals. But my goals are just prior beliefs about the kind of consequences something like me would expect to encounter. And then I just choose the action that brings about those most characteristic outcomes. And in so doing, in selecting or choosing that particular course of action, I am now evincing an intentional stance or acting upon an intention. And I don't think you'll find you wouldn't need that kind of generative model with a thermostat or with two clocks, swinging in generalized synchrony.
Right. Yeah, so I find Terence Deacon's term teleodynamics kind of useful here when it comes to thinking about life. So he speaks about
Ah,
kind of
that's probably one of the
self-organized.
words that I learned that I learned about.
Maybe it came up in the book. Yeah. Yeah. So to refer, he talks, obviously thermodynamics, and then he talks about morphodynamics, where you have forms come into existence like the really Bernard cells. If you heat up a pan of water, they can hexagonal structures, and then teleodynamics, where a system can has a goal-directed self-organization. So and to me that kind of is one of the best terms to kind of define what's special about life or different about life compared to these other forms. And I think that is inherently connected with agency, because I guess I would say if I take the simplest, cellular life form, single-celled organism, it will, and if I take actions that will lead to its death, and it has the capacity to try and avoid that. If I heat up the water on one side, where it is, it will take actions to evade that. So it's dynamics seem to. I'm comfortable, even if this is kind of qualitative descriptions as we do in biology sometimes. I'm comfortable saying that system shows it's organized around this goal of self-persistence in a way that I can melt down the thermostat, and it's not going to try and stop me, and it's not going to take active steps to avoid that. So there seems to me a disjunction between, or a kind of a kind of genuine level of emergence with cellular life that does involve what I'm calling agency or teleodynamics, having goals, a kind of self-organization that's qualitatively different to other self-organizing forms. And I don't rule out that there's some interesting like autocatalytic sets or like strange, biotic stuff going on like viruses or whatever, these kind of gray zone areas. But there does seem to be this nonlinearity where, it's the same nonlinearity between life and death. When you die, suddenly it's almost like teleodynamics keeps you together actively through your life, and then the moment you die, you shift into reverse gear, and now suddenly the second law is going to win. So that feels like that's the best way I can describe it, maybe in a hand wavy way, in terms of like shifting direction, in terms of anchoring to some goal of self-persistence. And again, there's nothing kind of funny going on here. This would just be, if it's possible for a system to internalize and act on the basis of such goals, then evolution or this process we're describing here would select for that, because it'd be a very good way to survive, is to be very invested, to structure everything about yourself around this act of trying to survive. Does that fit with the picture you were describing?
Yeah, absolutely. No, the poetry in your book is now coming back to me. Now,
Okay. I'm channeling it
yeah.
now, yeah.
So that teleodynamics is exactly what I was trying to imply by having the distinction between something that looks ahead, is future pointing, anticipates. You use the word actively avoids, for example,
Right.
but of course it's avoiding something in the future, whereas the virus or the thermostat would have a homeostasis and would have sort of reflexive responses, but they are in the moment. I think the ability to transcend the moment and to get into the future and then preemptively respond, I think that for me would be a bright line that distinguishes one natural kind from another natural kind. Um, the If you were a physiologist, you'd probably equate that with the difference between a homeostasis and allostasis.
Right.
Having a slightly sort of slower process that contextualize and now we're into the world of different ways of labeling generative models in terms of the hierarchical depth. So literally, having a deep model, very much in the spirit of deep learning and machine learning, just means having a hierarchical depth. And one aspect of this sort of scale-free nature that we were discussing before is as you have deeper and deeper levels to your models or scales to your models, they encompass greater periods of time. And this now equips you. So when I said before, if your generative model is equipped with the ability to model the consequences of your action, which is essentially to have a teleodynamics baked into the priors of your model, then you necessarily have to have a deep model, and a deep model that is able now to free itself from the lived moment, the specious present, and then get into the future in your head. And there are lots of ways of articulating that. So I think this is a fundamental, sort of fundamental kind of dynamics, which is not universal. That certainly would be apt to describe things like you and me.
Right. And in your writing on consciousness, yeah, you write about the particular aspect of these models, their counterfactual depth, the ability to model things as being the way they aren't currently. So a goal would be you need some kind of counterfactuality, I guess, even just to get off the ground with, say you're hungry, and you can have this goal of not being hungry. There's something that's different that goes against the fact that you're currently hungry, and then you have this. I think you also describe it as counterfactual breadth, because you've kind of got temporal depth of how far in the future can you plan, but then how many options, how many routes can you take to get there, and you write about this being kind of this property perhaps being the basis of the language I would use would be to say the gradual emergence of the kind of elaboration of the contents of consciousness is how I would describe it, in terms of, for us to have this rich experience of being a person inhabiting a world over time, that requires something big and complex like a brain to really flesh out all those counterfactualities and navigating in the world. But the reason, so that fits nicely with this kind of gradualist view that perhaps it's only with nervous systems, or particularly complex nervous systems, that you get experience. But then there's this other piece where, so I saw about a year ago, you had a conversation with Thomas Metzinger, which is available, I think, on the Philosophy Babble YouTube channel. And his work very much resonates with how I think about these things, in terms of, I'm emphasizing the contents of consciousness here, because you could also point to the kind of epistemic space, which is a term he uses, of awareness, the kind of formless, empty canvas on which those contents are arising, and that can become with practices like meditation, that can become really clear that there's something that's unaffected by what arises in it. He refers to it as pure consciousness. I typically use formless awareness. And that seems to, unlike the kind of gradual enriching of the contents of consciousness, that seems to have a certain binary quality, where it's the kind of a space that is a bit like a space can't exist a little bit, or a perspective can't exist a little bit. It kind of either is or it isn't. If you're hiding and you peek out very slightly, you have a full-blown perspective in that moment. So it's my recognition of that binary aspect of awareness that leads me to think that the bright line is the term you used for it before, in that the way we're talking about these teleodynamics of life. I feel like that capacity for consciousness to come online comes in. I don't see any other bright lines in the evolution of life where such a disjunction exists. But then I'm open to the possibility that there's minimal contents, in simple organisms. But I think that, yeah, that is the only bright line I see there. So I ended up rambling a bit there about my whole perspective. But yeah, I wonder if you could share your thoughts on the kind of counterfactual depth and contents of consciousness.
Yeah, and Thomas Metzinger.
Yeah.
Very happy to do that. So, yeah, just to rehearse this notion of counterfactual futures. As you say, if I now have a model of my lived world that is not just states of affairs in the moment, but also the future that is conditioned upon how I act in that world, then I have a many universe kind of, not problem, but space in which to explore. We have counterfactual futures. It could be like this or it could be like that. Because technically, what that I'm not sure that your listeners are going to find this useful, but I think it's a beautiful mathematical aspect of this calculus or basic mechanics. As soon as you move into the future, your observations, your sensations, your sensorium ceases to be something that is observable and becomes a random variable because it has not yet been observed. As soon as it's a random variable, it has to be inferred, which means that, and because now the observations now have to be inferred, that basically switches around the mathematics of the information theoretic mathematics, which is exactly what we were talking about before. That in the moment I'm trying to minimize my surprise, but in the future I'm trying to maximize it, simply because what I'm surprised about no longer is known. It's now an unknown variable. And then the space of different futures that my generative model could consider, the space of counterfactual futures, is clearly limited by the physics of my biological structure and the degrees of freedom that are available to it, and can have two attributes: is how far into the future that you can entertain, and that would be the depth, the depth in time on the temporal horizon that I can roll out. It's usually upper bounded though, because the whole point about sort of having a calculus of beliefs that is inherent in the free energy principle and its attendant basic mechanics is that you have a measure of uncertainty or inverse uncertainty, which is called precision. So as you go into the future, the uncertainty increases and everything becomes equally probable or equally plausible or equally goally. And therefore you don't have to run out too far, just to the extent that your uncertainty will allow you to discriminate or disambiguate between one course of action or one path into the future and another path into the future. The breadth you talk about is, I think, the degree to which your future is coarse-grained. That's the term that Daniil Seth first articulated, in terms of his treatment of interoceptive inference or active inference, focusing on the bodily domain and the interoceptive, explaining interoceptive cues and sensations, and that just tells you how broad the latitude you have for different kinds of futures that could play out. And I think this notion of a counterfactual future is absolutely essential because, unlike the thermostat, unlike possibly a virus, it means that you have to select one of a number of different futures. Technically, this is Bayesian model selection, where each model of the future is a hypothesis, and you have to now select the right hypothesis and then commit to that through, or then that informs how you're going to actually act. So this notion of selection rears its head again. We were talking before about sort of evolutionary selection, but the same mechanism is at play. As soon as you have counterfactual futures, you've got to choose between them, which means you have to select in order to act. And I think that's quite fundamental. And again, if we use the thermostat as a sort of an example of something that doesn't have that, or BZ, or any active matter, or sort of other kinds of self-organization that don't entertain a future, then they don't have this problem. that you and I have, which is the selection problem. The second issue, which is I thought very nicely articulated, was this notion of how how we well. I'm tempted to use lots of phrases from Thomas Metzinger's formulation, but the phenomenology that we would want to associate with systems that have a very deep temporal horizon and possibly a great latitude of futures from which they can select that have this counterfactual breadth. What kinds of systems must they be? Well, first of all, because you've now gone into the future, you have to have a deep model. In the sense that you need at least one other level. So I'm now speaking to our bright line. In order to have a future, we now need to have something on top of a generative model, or a level or a scale of a generative model that is looking at the reflexive, very fast generative model that's primarily engaged in the environment. So I think that sort of qualitative distinction you were talking about that eludes gradualism is whether your model is deep or not. You can't be part deep. You're either deep or you're not. And as soon as you have at least one other scale to your model, then suddenly you have the opportunity now to model the future at a different time scale from your actual engagement with the world. So what does that mean practically? Well, it means that you've got to be sufficiently big in order to have the conditional independences we were talking about before that underwrite the Markov blanket or the separation. So if a deep level or layer in my internal states in my brain, for example, is a thing, then it has to be separable from the first layer, the one that's juxtaposed to the sensory input and the motor or autonomic outputs or reflexes, which means that there's a certain conditional independence, which means that there has to be a separation between the deep layer and the sensory layer or the sensorium, which necessarily implies a certain kind of anatomy. So if you're a cell biologist, immediately that tells you that if you want this kind of qualitative distinction in terms of biological self-organization, you have to have a multicellular organism, for example. A single cell can't do it because there's no separation within the intracellular space of a hierarchical sort. But as soon as you have a multicellular organism, you've now got an image where the outer layer of cells is contending with its external milieu or its lived world, but the inner ones are somehow standing back and can look at what the exterior, the more peripheral layer or level or scale is actually doing. And as soon as you use phrases like "it can look at," then you immediately are licensed to talk about mental action. And this is where we get back to Metzinger, because if I've now got this notion of heuristically, say, a brain that has the structure of an onion with layer upon layer upon layer going deeper and deeper and deeper as we get to the center or the very deepest part, which for Mark Soames would have a very particular meaning here, then you've now got the opportunity to think about one layer or one level, one scale that is acting upon, looking at scales below. So now, because looking is an action, you have to ask yourself what kind of mental actions would be entailed by looking at some internal processing within my brain. And it transpires that this is a key feature of any sense-making, the basic mechanics that attends the free energy principle. And that feature is basically the precision that you afford, or the confidence, or the the way that you estimate that this particular message input to my Markov blanket at this scale is newsworthy. And then if you read that mechanics as attention. You've now got a really tight relationship between mental action, attention, and what Thomas Metzinger would now describe in terms of rendering that which was transparent phenomenally, phenomenologically, or no, phenomenally opaque. So as soon as you have this qualitative distinction where I am deep, whereas before I was shallow on some phylogenetic scale, then you have the capacity in principle for mental action. If you have the capacity for mental action, then you now have the capacity for some kind of elemental qualitative experience of phenomenology, simply because you can act upon your sense making at different levels.
Right. Yeah, that really tees us up really nicely to talk about the Metzinger's work on the emergence of selfhood and but also pure consciousness stuff and the inner screen model that you teed up earlier. But unfortunately, we're out of time and I need to head off. So maybe we can save that for a future conversation. But yeah, thank you so much, Carl. Really, really enjoyed chatting.
Right. Well, I look forward to the next one. We can do Chris Field and Thomas Metzinger and
Sounds
bring
great.
together mental action in the screens.
Sounds great. All right. Until then.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.